Welcome back to yet another episode of your Re-Educated podcast. We are moving strong with season 12. Today we have an extremely special guest, Gabrielle Oliveira. She is an anthropologist and scholar of migration whose work explores how families move, adapt, and parent across borders. Drawing on ethnographic research in Mexico, Brazil, and the United States, she examines the educational experiences of immigrant children and the often unseen labor of caregivers navigating transnational lives. She is the award winning author of Motherhood Across Borders, a landmark study on how separation, reunification, and mobility shape childhood. A faculty member deeply engaged with communities, she works closely with teachers in dual language programs to understand how schools can better support newcomer students. Her research brings together anthropology, education, and storytelling to illuminate the human realities behind global migration. How are you doing today?
Good, good. This is like I joke that sometimes when you don't know if you're doing things that matter, just have somebody write your bio back to you and you're like, all right, okay, I have something to say. This is pretty good.
Yeah.
But thanks for having me. I'm excited.
No, of course. And we were before we started recording, we were just talking about children, and I've just been really fascinated to I'm getting to that point. I was telling you, I was getting to that point in my life where, friends are having children. I feel like it's at this point, if I was to have a child, I wouldn't be so unprepared in the same way that I would have been maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And so it's something that seems a little bit more plausible. I mean, what is one thing you feel like you didn't expect to learn having children that you feel like you did now?
It's interesting because I think with having children, every phase you are, you think that that's the hardest, you know? And I think there's a reason kids grow in the pace that they grow. So then you're out of that phase. So I think the thing that I've learned is that there's, little children, little problems, bigger children, bigger problems in terms of just like how things get harder for you to parent and you want to be there. They don't need you as much. So I think the phases have been really surprising to me. Like every year, I feel like I unlock a new phase. And I was like, oh, how do we do this now? So it's a forever learning job.
I mean, I think the really fascinating thing is even thinking about teaching in my own practice. I feel like teaching before children and teaching after children must be such a different experience because maybe your ability to relate and understand and maybe even see your students as some extension of your children might completely change the way. Have you noticed that by any chance?
Yeah, it's interesting because so in my first book, Motherhood Across Borders, I did that whole project and I wasn't a parent yet. And I felt like it was really cool because I really took a learner's perspective. Like I was learning from the women, they had a baby. I was at a hospital when somebody gave birth and they brought a baby home and they had two toddlers and they were trying to make ends meet and all of that. So in my research, I could see just how wide-eyed, I was just looking at parents parent. And then after that, when I had my own kids, I think, I took a lot of those learnings with me. It also became a lot more heart-wrenching in the sense of I would do the exact same thing that those parents are doing to support their children. And it's even more heartbreaking when you can see just the amount of privilege I get to go back to my kids every night, right? Even I'm doing research, but a lot of these parents that I work with don't get to do that. And I think so that for me, I had to like even take a little bit of a break between my second book that is, was on family separation as well, but because I just wanted to be sure I was not just projecting all of my fears and nervousness and heartbreak and all of that, so I could really see a difference.
I mean, I this is something I kind of struggle with where I've been having a hard time teaching because every time I get to live in the world of abstract, it's so nice having these ideals, setting these principles, but then once you have to actually see them in practice or action, there's always like a divide between what you aim for versus what you're able to do in that moment. And I feel like parenting is definitely one of those things where in researching or learning, you probably learn all these different ways to think about it, but in practice, sometimes when you're hungry or you're tired, or it's hard to still replicate that same ideal. Do you sometimes have that challenge between practice and abstraction or ideals?
Absolutely. I think you described exactly the paradigm, which is kind of also as a researcher, right? I consume research. I read all the papers, not just in anthropology, but in psychology, in child rearing, right? So in theory, I see the research of what we should be doing to support the growth of our children. But then, when you're doing in practice, you also figure out that each child needs something different. So while, I have two kids and while I'm doing something with one, it does not work with the other one. And it is more on the flexibility. That is the skill, I think, as a parent that we just don't talk about it enough. We have all these books on parenting that kind of give you a recipe of if you tell your kids every day that you love them, that they're valuable, that they're amazing, and that's going to work. Or if you do more gentle parenting where you meet them where they are and think about do they not want to put the shoes on? Is there something else going on? So and then you go and you try to implement that and it doesn't work. And you're thinking, is it me? Did I not do exactly what I read in the research to do? But the truth of the matter is it's an interaction, right? It's that child's temperament and socialization, right? And your temperament and your so coming together. And sometimes you just need to be really quick and adapt. And I think kids, they smell blood, they smell fear. So if they get any sense that you're fumbling, that you're trying to figure out, they're going to explore the boundaries as they should. So it's on kind of like the parents to figure out how much flexibility you have to change course.
Hmm. I mean, I think this is where I'm really excited to today even just get into migration because I think one of the most fascinating things is every culture carries so many narratives and just like hidden stories about how to parent, what is okay, how much flexibility is okay. I mean, even saying I love you to their child. I mean, the culture that I grew up in, that wasn't something that was practiced. And I think because of that, your expectation for that is so different than perhaps if you lived in a culture where that's common across a lot of your peers. And then you're like, how come my parents don't say that to me? But
Mhm.
it these stories shape so much, and I find migration to be really fascinating because you're not just moving places. I mean, you're moving entire philosophies, ways of thinking, and that I think deeply shape everything. And then I feel like as a child of an immigrants, I feel like it's fascinating to have to experience that kind of in your day to day, where every single thing, whether it's about love, family, what you're supposed to do, what is a good life, each one of these things differs so wildly that in the process of migration, I think what you're really doing is the highest level of philosophy, where you have to kind of merge these two vastly different ways of thinking. So I'm super excited to get into migration today, but I kind of wanted to first lay out like a history of what is it that we're seeing today in terms of how much people are moving, and how does that compare to what it was like 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago?
Right, and that's a great point. And I like to say that migration is as basic as drinking water and sleeping, right? It's a necessity. It's a survival strategy. That's always how it's been. Our numbers are just larger now because we have more people living in the world, right? So we have about 280 million people that are on the move. About 36 to 40 million are children, right? And those
Wow.
are huge numbers. So proportionally, we've always had a high proportion of the population that we're moving. Think about any war, think about any conquest, think about any, you know, uh, especially through force, or now we're seeing a lot because of the environment, right? Just the different things that people have to go because you can no longer grow a crop or you can no longer survive in some of these spaces. So it's always been like that in terms of movement. What we see now that is different is that our borders are more surveilled, are more secured, and it's more complicated to go from one place to another. Um, and there's a discourse now that underlies people's movement, which is about fear, right? So people are saying there's too many people coming into my neighborhood or my city that look like this. There's too many people. And then it becomes somewhat of like a culture war, right? Of not just migrants arriving, but what kind of migrants are more or less welcome in this place. But it's always been like that. People have always moved. We just have a lot more people. The numbers are larger. We have bigger media outlets that are reporting on that in ways that wasn't as visible as before. And we're driven by a narrative of fear that kind of underlies a lot of what we're seeing today.
Yeah. I mean, and I'm assuming maybe because there weren't planes for a long time, migration probably was a lot closer in proximity. And so I find India to be really fascinating for this because if you just take a train through India, you actually see the gradients of culture because each state to state is so vastly different. As you take a train and you just look outside or you talk to people, you go from 100% one culture to 0% of the other, and you start traveling, you slowly see 90, 80, 70, 60, 50, and then it starts, moving into that direction. And in any 100 kilometers you move, you experience that thing where you're like, you feel that slight transition out of one culture into another one in terms of people's clothing, what language they're speaking, the way they dance and eat. And it's so cool to me because it's like I would assume for a long time migration had that kind of gradual process. But
Mhm.
now you could just, if things work out or you're able to find a job or whatever other means, you're able to actually switch in such a insane degree extremely quickly in in a day, right? I mean, if you travel somewhere, you can just and then you choose to stay there for an extended period of time, all of a sudden in one day you can have this like complete shift. And so that I feel like what is the difference between those two?
Mhm. Yeah, and I think what you're bringing attention to is also the levels of inequality as well. So I think what you describe right now, right? Like in terms of I came to the US because I wanted from Brazil because I wanted to study. So I made a choice, right? Like paraphrasing a little bit of your words. If you choose to go to a different place, so you make those choices. And I think that's one type of migration that it's the speed is way faster, as you said, right? I can take a train, I can drive a car and just be somewhere else or take an airplane so much quicker than before people would have to jump on a ship and be there for months to try to make it to the other side. And with all the diseases and all the things happening on the boat, like who knows who made it and how, right? It was just so like the precarity of that. At the same time, what we see now, because of the level of surveillance that we have, in the different borders. What you have is it's faster to arrive. At the same time, the level of surveillance is higher in the sense that it's become a lot more criminalized to be in a place different than the other, right? So I think those things are interesting to think about. One being the freedoms of, with privilege, being able to be in different places and navigate that at a much higher speed at the same time that you have inequality growing and you can see how people are trying to move from one place to another in order to find jobs to have a better life, right? So kind of migration to close the gap. It's almost the way that a lot of people are thinking about. Um, and we see the example now with the US Mexico border, which there's so many, the history of the US Mexico border up until the mid 90s was one that there's a lot more circular migration, right? People would come in, work for 9 months, go back to Mexico, be there, have their families be based in Mexico. The mid 1990s, you kind of bring this militarized aspect to the border where people are now kind of, if I make it to the US, I have to stay there. There's no more circular. So there's a little bit of that in different places, around the world where once you make it in, it's harder to go out and back. And then you end up staying, you create a family, then you have a second, third generation immigrant, versus before where you have more of a circular aspect to coming and going.
So, I mean, it's fascinating because policies can drastically shape these like human processes that have existed for so long into what is and isn't normal. I mean, even it's just all fascinating because the concept of a country is also kind of like a made up concept.
Mhm.
And so the idea of like, I'm not allowed to be here, I am allowed to be here is also made up on this thing that we've kind of just constructed. And I've always found that, yeah, I mean, all of it's fascinating, like my property and you're trespassing, but I don't know, how do you define it being yours really? But I guess one thing I'm really curious to know a little bit more about is like, It feels like, and correct me if I'm wrong, is xenophobia the fear of immigrants or different
It's like a
people?
race ethnicity, right? So you discriminate based on the race and ethnicity of the person of. So if you're from this origin, then I think you're going to be bad or evil or something, associated with that.
Yeah. I'm just curious in just what you've seen, like, because we talked a little bit about the fear of the fear of migrants in general. What, how large of that would you say comes from a kind of racist or just like a stereotypical kind of view of other people versus how much of it is rooted in genuine fear of like difference?
Yeah, yeah. No, I think you make a great point. And I would say it's both, right? I think the racialization of immigration, which means that, when you see people coming and going, there is kind of the idea of the good and the bad immigrant, the good and the bad refugee. What do they look like, right? And then you see now for some politicians using that narrative of, kind of attaching that to a race, ethnicity, and country of origin. But I do think it's a mix of both. One is racism, which has always existed, and kind of the tropes of the who are the lazy people, who are the people that don't want to work hard, who are the people that are not elevating society, right, for this like idea of what society should be like, right? And there is this idea of people of color and not and white, right? So that has always been historically how people have thought about this, and this idea of the fear of the different, which for a lot of people that means that somebody's going to take something from you that is yours. And it's not this idea that you're growing something, right? So it's interesting to me to hear that the narrative about immigrants is that they're coming here. And when I say here, it could be anywhere in the world, right? They're coming here to take, but in reality, they're coming to give, right? Give their blood, sweat, and tears, give their hours to work, give something to their children, give and provide, right? So this idea of taking, I think is very central to the fear piece, but it's very much attached to a racist foundation of who counts as a human worthy of dignity, right? And a life. And we can see that, very clearly with even the different discourses of, you don't see just in the United States, but it's been interesting to hear some politicians talk about how some immigrants are not compatible with Western civilization. That for me has been really interesting to hear that language that for me was like language from the late 80s, early 90s to kind of just become so central in how people are talking about this. What do you mean Western civilization? That's kind of a very racist way to think about who belongs, you know? So it's been interesting to hear kind of that type of language has been brought back to explain that fear.
What do you think people do mean when they say that? Like, it's Western ideals, or there must be certain ways of thinking or being that falls under that, right?
Yeah, I think religion is a huge part of it. I think now there is this demonization, right, of Muslim and Islam as a religion, and kind of looking at, you have people talking about London, New York City with the new mayor elected, right? So this demonization is spreading around more, and it's become, we've seen the moments in history that it made it worse, right? 9/11, what happened in Israel, right? So you can see how those moments just really bring people that already had some of those ideas, but they bring it to the forefront, what it means. So I do think religion, um, and the color of your skin really matter for how people think about what is happening in their cities. So even though, like I'm Brazilian and I can see just the differentiation that you have as being I'm a white Brazilian person versus if you have a Brazilian who's a person of color, how you're treated, how you're received, and the privileges that you have navigating society. And I think people have been allowed to say that much more louder and clearly than what they have before,
Hmm.
which is not a good thing, in my
Yeah.
opinion.
So in your opinion, then, how do you feel like conversations? about migration or just immigration in general can be had, because I think there is an important conversation to be had there, which brings up a whole bunch of interesting things of what does it mean to be us? Why do we have this fear? I mean, there's so many conversations that I think can be really fruitful that come from that conversation. But how do you think that can be had separated from the kind of like maybe hatefulness that seems to arise often when we do talk about it?
I think there's a real conversation about infrastructure, right? In terms of when you think about immigration, in terms of, I do work in Brazil as well with Venezuelan migration to Brazil. And I see the difference. Like you have a city in the north of Brazil where I do a lot of my research that has a very vulnerable infrastructure. So what that means not a lot of hospitals, not a lot of schools, right? Higher unemployment. So when you have high flows entering a place with low infrastructure, it's going to stress the infrastructure of the city. It will, right? And then your hospitals are going to become more crowded, and your schools are going to become more crowded, and you're going to, as a government with not a lot of money to do a lot of things, you're going to feel that you're underserving your own citizens. And you're going to, so all those things, they matter for conversation. They shouldn't be sidelined. Those are real preoccupations that we need to think about what it means to have a population number that expands. But I think that's different from saying, now we have bigger numbers of people that we have to figure out how to serve versus we don't want to serve them because they're Venezuelan, right? We don't want to serve them because they speak this language. We don't want to, that's different
Hmm.
from kind of thinking about what's our limit here. We don't have a budget. We can't expand. So that may mean that people are living in the streets. That's not good. So we can't have that. So what are we supposed to do, right? And I think in Brazil they've tried to do this strategy where people, even though people would enter in this one city in the very north of Brazil, which is closer to the Venezuelan border, they had this program where they would try to have people go to different states in Brazil to kind of distribute in places where they could assure you would have a job and you could go to school. So I understand those policies. I don't think it's there shouldn't be discriminatory in that way, but they become because it becomes pointing the fingers, right? We're ruined because of immigration. Our schools are suffering because of immigration, right? So those are the things that I find it important to kind of untangle.
Hmm. But in the examples you gave, are they not overstressed because of immigration?
They are, but it's if the conversation is we're overstressed because of the number of people that are coming, what is the solution to do that? That's
Hmm.
going to lead you to a solution that is different from we're overstressed because there are Venezuelan people here and we don't like them, right?
Got it.
So if
Yeah.
you don't like them, then your policies are going to be deport, remove, separate, send back. That's going to be your array of possible policies. But if it's about a number piece, you're thinking about where else can they go? Is the government or is the UN going to give us more money to build more schools? Who's in this with us, right? To expand what we have as infrastructure. How do we do this? What's the plan versus the pack and remove? So those are
Yeah.
some of the conversations that I find helpful to think about.
Yeah. And separated even from some of those terms you said earlier, like lazy or
Right.
looking to take. I mean, kind of, yeah. I mean, yeah. I mean, there's just a lot of beautiful people on the just planet, and I think, I mean, there's a lot of amazing people, and I feel like that there is this deep fear of just the unknown that often
Mhm.
arises, and like a fear of people who think different. And I think a lot of this ties deeply to how we teach in our education, which I'm really
Mm,
excited to get into now, where I feel like my experiences in the uh, schooling system here in the US, I feel like for the first 6 years, I feel like there was no, so I grew up in a city where just recently I saw the number that 80% of the students are first generation immigrants, or children
mm,
of first generation immigrants. And I mean, that is fascinating. I mean, that means everybody's coming from all over the world. But in the classrooms that I was in, there was never a single question of like, what was your life like? What
mm,
is your life like at home? What is your life like in the countries that you came from? Share your culture. It was kind of like the teacher, who is usually white, would kind of share what being American was like, and then it's kind of like you picked and choose what that meant and you learned from them. I'm curious in your perspective when it comes to education, how much of that is actually just like teaching students what it means to be part of the larger society as a whole, which means to like learn what it means to be American or whatever that means. Is that, I guess, a large role of what schools are meant to do?
I think so, right? I feel like every now and then I come off as a little bit idealistic about the roles of schools, especially public schools. I want to believe in their potential, even though they're struggling across, right? The talking about the United States, but my gosh, like if I think about my own right, Brazil also struggling, public school, public education is struggling, but it's interesting because this idea of which you described, which is an idea of assimilation, right? Like you're here, you put your head down, you work hard, so you can be a deserving person, right? So prove to us that you're deserving of being here in this great country and all of that, right? Which is this learning how to be American, for example, like just to use some of the words you shared. The thing with that is that for some students it could be great, right? Clearly for you, you're still discovering the world. You're a learner at heart. You enjoy this. So even though they didn't do that in school, it didn't stop you from developing that. So there's an argument here. At the same time, I think that for what we see with students is that the biggest thing that a teacher can do for a student inside the classroom is to have high expectations, and those high expectations are not about like you being put under so much pressure that you freak out and have an anxiety attack and can't perform. It's about your teacher thinking highly of you. Like these kids can do this. They're smart, they're hard workers, right? They have an asset mind of looking at the students, not a deficit mind. So I think that idea of asking about home and asking about how it was, for each of the students is so crucial because it builds that trust where students are feel seen. And if they trust the teacher and the teacher have high expectations, they're going to deliver. They're going to deliver, especially in elementary school, where for young students, 5 to 11, teachers are still their world. They want to impress the teachers, they want to be liked, they want to do well. When they're teenagers, a little bit more different. But when they're younger, they want that, right? So if the teacher shows interest and want to know and all, that also develops that trust, which leads to higher expectations and more engagement. So I think that in itself is an important piece of the puzzle.
Hmm. I actually, yeah, I mean, feeling seen, I think that's such like a huge piece of a lot of this because I think the part that kind of I'm trying to understand like how to navigate is I don't know why there is so little of like teachers asking students questions, like why that's like not a very common practice. I mean, especially when because if I didn't experience that in the places that I grew up where the students know far more than the teacher about so many things. I mean, if somebody was to ask me anything about what it's like to grow up in the place in India, the way that I did or whatever, I mean, it's I would have so much to share. But even in that environment, if there's no questions being asked, I can't imagine how little there is when two people are from similar environments or
Mhm.
similar backgrounds where they could probably just assume, I probably know everything you already know, right? And so it's like they're that when two people are that different and the questions are still basically just not asked, it must be yeah. I don't know how you would go about feeling seen, but to do that, I think there has to be a certain openness to wanting to learn about other cultures. And so, what are some of the practices that you've seen that seem to actually like do that well, from a certain place of openness rather than judgment?
Yeah, and there's also another thing that I see that happens a lot in classrooms, which is some teachers do feel very strongly that they want to protect the kids from being re-traumatized or even other kids from being traumatized, right? So, and I'm using trauma here in a kind of popular, way that how people have been calling everything trauma, right? But this idea that if a child, and I have documented that a lot in my research, one of the examples that I really like that I've written about is I'm in this classroom, a first grade classroom, and you're at morning meeting, which for those of you not familiar, you're sitting around the rug, right? The kids are,
Oh,
knee to knee, and the teacher's going around, and there's a couple icebreakers, and then the teacher goes around and she's asking if kids brought lunch from home or if they're going to buy lunch from school. So she's going one by one, and she's asking, Pedro, are you going to buy lunch from school or did you bring lunch from home? And then the students are like, well, what is the lunch? What is the hot lunch at school? And the teacher says, oh, so today is going to be fajitas, which are these, and she explains what it is, this hot vegetables that are wrapped into this tortilla, which is a type of bread. So she's explaining all of that. And then a first grader says, huh, that's interesting. That's what they gave us to eat when we were in that prison, right? Out of the blue, first grader, if you've been in an elementary, kindergarten, first grade, kids say stuff. That's the beauty of their little brains, is that they blurt out things that you have no idea where they're going. So the teacher is like, oh, all right, the 6-year-old just said that she was fed something similar like that in prison. What does that even mean, right? Another kid raises his hand and says, oh, I know what you're saying. It's those things that they were frozen inside and they gave us to eat. So what do we know? Both of these kids came to the US-Mexico border, were detained with their families, were in a detention facility where they do provide frozen burritos for kids to eat. So the fajitas triggered the idea of the burritos, and they shared that in a morning meeting. I'm sorry I have this like long tangent, but I'm about to land the plane. But it's this idea that they're sharing something that is so important for them that it feels very salient, right? They trust the teacher, they trust the classroom. They're doing everything that they can to kind of say, this matters for me. And the teacher says, okay, not the time, not the place. Next, did you bring lunch from home or are you going to buy lunch from school? Right. So this is not on the teacher, and this is not a dig on the teacher. This is not me pointing the finger saying, see, she didn't, because for this teacher, what is she supposed to do there? Does she stop the whole class and talks about a 6-year-old being detained and imprisoned? Right? Does she lean in? Does she lean? What is she supposed to do? And one of the things that we see that the practices that really work is an acknowledgement of that. Thank you for sharing that. Right? That's really important. I'd love to hear more. And even bring in an assignment where kids can draw about it, can write their narratives, and that corresponds to their literacy development, right? Especially if you're talking about first grade. So the practices that I've seen that really work are when you allow kids to find ways to express themselves in their own language or with their own experiences inside the classroom in a way that becomes validated as real knowledge as opposed to sidelined knowledge. And the teachers, we need to be better at training teachers so that they know what to do then and say, I'm going to incorporate that into an assignment. Why not have that 6-year-old do a drawing, right? And a narrative about what happened to her. And then the teacher have a debriefing with them, hear more about it, involve the psychologist, think about, what are the things that we can be doing here to support the children. But teachers will be reticent about that too because they're nervous about, are these kids' status going to be too visible? And now that could put them in danger, right? If we know that they're documented, asylum seekers, what do we do here? So anyway, this is like a long story just to show
no.
you just the complexity of how these practices are so important that they can be very micro. They don't need to be huge, right, in the classroom.
I feel like what a lot of what you said, thank you for sharing, by the way. I feel like what kind of came up for me is just how limited my perspective is. I feel like every time I reach this kind of this this edge, it pains me to be like, I know nothing. Like I know so little about every because it's like I don't know why in this whole conversation, and you had mentioned it earlier too, but I feel like now that you gave a vivid example, like because of who I've grown up around and what I've seen, my understanding of migration is so different than the examples that you're talking about or the kind of situations that people need to go through. And it's just so crazy how much you don't know, and that how much that limits your ability to actually have some of these conversations. Because it's like I actually know nothing about migration in the sense of the all the other reasons why, right? I mean, even you mentioned it earlier that I had mentioned chosen migration, where there's
Mhm.
so many reasons, whether it's a famine or a war or, a whole bunch of um, where it's not really a choice. It's just something you kind of have to do. And then the processes that can happen when you need to like that are so different than when you're like an educated engineer and they're like, "Ah, come over." So it's night and it's very different. And
Mhm.
so, I mean, I guess I'm just curious, just on that note, and then we can get back to it. I'm just curious, what do you do in your own kind of work how do you know what you don't know?
Mm, My gosh, I love that question. And I even ask my students, I also ask my students, how do you know that you know? Which I also think is, another side of that coin. And I think for me, my status quo, like just the way I operate, is that I don't know, right? I think that's in my brain. And I think uh I had one student this term in the fall. I was teaching methods, and he was talking a lot about like awe moments, like what have been awe, right? The AWE moments. And I was explaining to him that I felt that for me, my awe moments are very small, like little things. So I think I'm very driven by unending curiosity that everything is interesting to me, which sometimes is frustrating to a lot of people around me because I'll just stay on a beat that is very small and micro for a while because I'm just so taken by that. And, my husband will say, okay, not everything is that interesting. Move on, right? And I'm like, no, everything is interesting. So I think to answer
Agreed.
your question, I feel that I operate from a place of not knowing, and I love that. I don't think that weakens who I am, my thought process. I'm not ashamed of it. I'm excited about it, which I think it's comes with time. Maybe when I was younger, I was nervous about not knowing, but I just operate with this idea that I don't know most things, and it is my job to ask questions to find out more.
Hmm. Here's yes, and I'm
How
I'm
do you
just
think
curious.
about it? How do you think about it?
I think I struggle because in my brain, my identity of myself is kind of this perpetual student.
Mhm.
But I have a friend who I was talking to, and he just brought up this interesting point where he was like, but at some point you transition from just learning into at some point you're like when you're a parent, you can no longer just like learn. You have to actually implement the things that you've learned. And
Mhm.
at that point, you kind of have to no longer be the student can kind of just be open to the world. That's what this podcast is, right? I don't have to actually objectively say anything. But if somebody asks me, like, okay, so, you've recorded almost 200 hours of conversations, what would you change to education? Then you no longer can just be the student. I actually have to kind of compile everything that I've learned and actually put that into something cohesive. And I
Mhm.
think at that point, you have to give your I think anyone who displays a certain healthy skepticism of their own ideas, people don't take seriously. Because like
Mm,
people appreciate when someone says, "I know the answers." When you
mm,
have these people who are super definitive and they believe, those people are really charismatic. If somebody's like, "This is what
mm,
I think," but I'm open to being proven wrong, they're like, "Why would I listen to you?" So I
mm,
think in that sense, when you're the perpetual student, what you believe actually never really gets implemented either. And I think
mm.
that's where the complexity is, right?
Yeah, I agree with you that people don't like the it depends answer. And, my advisor when I was in grad school, she gave me a lot of it depends, and I loved it because for me, it just gave me multiple avenues to think about it. And I agree with you. I think there's like I guess it's like these two things happening at the same time, right? One, I do feel like I have expertise on things, right? Immigration and education, immigrant parenting, transnational work, all the things you said in my nice intro, right? I do feel like I'm an expert in that. I can tell you things from my observations and my work that feel, definitive in some sense, right? But that's one dimension of who I am, right? So I think the trick is that some people take that dimension and that becomes their whole identity for everything. And that I don't like because then I feel like you're bullshitting me when you transfer that, sense of self to everything else. So just because you're good at talking about microeconomics, it doesn't mean that you're going to be a good, uh, person for me to listen about art history. It doesn't mean that. Maybe you are, maybe you're not. But I think some people are very good about transferring the ethos of expertise to multiple dimensions. I don't love that because I like the authentic self. And if it means that you're saying, I don't know, or I could be open to changing my mind, but you're doing that in an authentic way, I buy that more than kind of this definitive take on this is how the world is, and this is what we know, and this is, I mean,
Mm,
I love a good podcast on like history of X, right? Tell me the history of something. I love it. I'm learning that. Doesn't mean that you can transfer that type of persona of expertise to everything else.
When you use this word expert, I'm really curious, like, does does that fall more under, like, compared to the general population? I know more about this one thing because I've spent so much time learning it, or does it mean I know most things in this subject, you know?
Yeah, I think it's the first one that I spent a lot of time into this one piece, which means that it's like in qualitative methods when I teach methods, right? Like as a qualitative researcher, what we don't do is we don't generalize data, right? Because of the work that I did with 20 families, I can't say that that's true for every single mother, every single Mexican mother that lives in the United States. That's not where I'm going. But I can generalize within that group because I spent 3 years, 3.5 years with that group of 20 families. And I've become an expert on their lives and what they're doing, right? In that way.
Yeah.
So I think a lot about like these expertises that are bounded by what you know, and who would have better information? Somebody that has a representative sample of Mexican mothers living in the United States who have left children in Mexico, and they run a survey, and it's a representative, number, and they get one answer, or me that spent 3.5 years with a group of 20 families, and I've logged thousands of hours, right, of interviews. Both of us,
Whoa.
we just have complementary knowledge, right, to bring that.
Mm,
So I think a lot about that, like some sort of vertical and horizontal knowledge that come together to explain like a bigger picture. So that's when I think about expertise. I think more in that way.
mm. I feel like I'm coming away with a really important lesson from just this conversation in general, which is just that, like, I feel like the part that can be painful sometimes is when you start to build an identity around I know, and then when you have these experiences where you confront, wait, actually I don't. And then when you have that kind of realization, it pains. But if you actually just go into the world saying, I don't know, but I'm going to try to learn as much as I
Mhm.
possibly can, and in that process, come up with ideas and theories and still share them, but it's an ongoing process. Then every time you come into new information, it's actually like an enjoyable experience because you're, oh, okay, I learned another perspective that I didn't have before. But
Right.
yeah, I mean, I'm really curious about the research that you just talked about right now, which is spending all that, you said, did you say thousands of hours?
Yeah.
That is insane. That is, I mean, how were you interviewing them every week,
Yes. So for
every
both,
day?
so that's kind of the for both my books, the first book, Motherhood Across Borders, and the one out now called Now We're Here. Both of them, the focus is on immigrant families, and the way that I do is ethnographically, which means that it's this kind of like deep hanging out, right? Where I
That's
am
amazing.
with these families every week, and I'm in their homes, in schools, doctors' offices, churches, dinner, park, right? Getting groceries, coffee, getting to the whatever it is, just being around in order to understand through participant observation, which means that I'm taking field notes at all times, right? And recording some of these conversations to understand how they do what they do, how they parent, which I always think is different from what people say. If you interview people, they're going to tell you all these things that they may want you to hear, right? Oh, I do this, that's how I parent. I think about my kids in this and way. And then you spend a day with them and you're like, well, that looked a little bit different from the things you were saying, right? And you want that because that's what we do. we say things and we do things differently because we're human beings. And that's kind of the method of research. So with these
Whoa.
families, that's the point, is to find the in between of what you say and what you do. There's like big,
Oh, that is so fascinating. I didn't know. So is that what a lot of like in-person ethnographic research looks like?
yes.
Oh my God,
And
that
it's
is
years and
amazing.
years and years, right? Like none of my
I
projects
would
were
love
less
to
than
do
three
something
years.
like this
You'd
one
be
day.
great. You'd be
I
great. I
would,
mean, you're already
oh my
doing
God.
it, like doing these interviews is in depth. It's just, and I have some students who'll be like, what's the difference between that and like a journalist that spends, a long
Good
time with
question.
like a history of one. And the thing with journalism is that first they're pressed by time, right? So they have to produce a story fairly quickly. That's not our goal. Our goal is kind of this long term, looking at multiple seasons, multiple spaces, multiple days of the week, right? Kind of the change across. And we are looking for these groups of people that are kind of moving along in patterns, right? So in many ways, that's what you're looking for while you're doing that. And it's fine for a journalist to write a story and not cite any other work and not put into conversation with any previous literature and not think about, the methods in a way. And it's great because that's their job. But our job is context heavy, right? Like we have to give you the entire
Hmm.
picture in a way so you can understand how I even made it to that classroom. Who were the kids that I just described to you that I was with? What's their story, right? So all of that means that you're spending a lot of time.
Wow. So can I ask you some core questions about this? It's just
Yeah, of
so
course.
fascinating.
Yeah.
Um, so so thousands of hours. How did you know? Like even in our conversation, we've tangented a lot. I mean, I feel like that naturally happens. But if I like lived with you, I don't even know if I wanted to learn one thing from you or a group of things about you. I feel like our conversations would take us all over the place. How do
Mhm.
you keep it kind of structured? How do you know you're not talking about basketball, or how do how do you keep it to what you're trying to find? Or yeah,
You don't.
yeah, you just let it
That's
go.
not that's not the process, right? The process is to actually go with what the participants are leading you to. So if I'm spending the
Wow.
day at a family's house and we never talk about immigration, even though that's what I'm studying, and the word immigration never comes up, and nobody's talking about what happened to them at the border or how it was to live in Honduras or in Guatemala or in Brazil before, that's okay, right? I can do that in an interview where I'll sit down and have an interview where we're going to talk about it. But rarely that happens, right? Because that's one of the findings of my work, is that that experience is so important for these families. What happened to them to leave home, travel, go through the border, arrive in the United States, try to make a life for them, that these things pop up in different ways, especially with children. So if I'm sitting down with 12-year-olds and we're painting our nails and I'm talking to, kids because that's just part of their afternoon, and kids will blurt out things and say, well, this reminds me when I was in Mexico and waiting to cross the border. And there was this one woman who would usually paint my nails. And I'll say, can you tell me more about that? And sometimes the kids will tell me more. And sometimes they'll say, no, I want to go get something to eat. So, then the next day I'm there, we'll talk more about it and more about it. But that's the point of ethnographic work, is that you're not going fishing for that information, but you actually are interested in how people think about something that may be interesting for
Wow.
you and how they articulate that in their everyday. So you're
That's
not going.
crazy.
So if I'm in the dinner and people are talking about, the last basketball game, I'm never going to be like, okay, but how about the border? How was that for you? Because I could do that in an interview, or I could do that in a survey, or I could do that. But the point of me being in their home or going is seeing how they go through their lives and what's important for them, what matters for them, and how they're trying to parent and raise their children, right? And in all my work, immigration becomes
Wow.
such a central part of how people are going through their lives. And how could it not, you know? So,
Dang. And you
but
wouldn't
think
have
about
seen
like in
that
your,
had you
sorry, go ahead.
No, you wouldn't have seen that had you purposely inserted that into every conversation. It's only by letting it kind of being like a fly on the wall, are you able to see how it naturally arises in their life, which in your experience, it naturally does a lot, which means
Right.
something even more than had you asked it at every dinner at a, you know?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And like think about how you grew up, right? Like how many times did your parents tell you straight up, I've done all these sacrifices for you, and now you have to be this amazing student and you have to do really well in school. How many times have they verbalized in that way using the words immigration, sacrifice, all of that? Like, can you think about if that was like an everyday thing or if, right?
A lot.
Maybe,
Yeah.
right? But
Yeah.
they also did that through their actions. And you started to understand what it meant for them for you to do well in school, let's say, right? Like sometimes they're being super clear with you and saying, using all the words about sacrifice and immigration, and sometimes just you would say, well, I grew up with my parents working really hard and I felt that the expectation was that I did X. And if I ask you, well, how did you feel that? And you start describing to me once at dinner, or they would tell me to go do my homework in this way, or they, whatever it is, right, that we're talking about. So all these actions, they kind of pile up into this larger discourse of what immigration means for a family. And in my world, education is a huge part of it, of how the parents justify what they want for their kids for the future, right? Is a better education.
Wow. This is so cool. So, I mean, so I have way too many questions. So, I mean, I wanted respect your time. I mean, I was just a quick question. Do you have like a hard limit, maybe in like 10, 15 minutes?
Yeah, yeah, that's good. Yeah.
Okay, great. I have so many questions because I have always wanted to do some. My dream goal, if I could live forever, is to interview every human that like lives and just like, but like if I could spend one day with every person, like this was, I had a dream where I just go to one person and I just talk to them about their life for a day, and then I ask them to send me to the next person, and then they send me to whoever they
Mm,
want, and I'm just so curious where that leads me in the world, like who
mm,
I end up meeting, what perspectives I end up uncovering, because I just think there's so many perspectives on this planet that just get lost because
mm,
either they don't have the resources to write, or they don't feel comfortable sharing, or whatever the long reason is. I think about my grandparents so much, where they lived such unique lives, but because they never wanted to write it down or didn't have the courage to, or and there were no pictures at that time when where they grew up, and I know nothing about their lives,
mm,
and those stories are completely gone. And so I've taken some effort now to interview the grandparents who are alive, and but still, I mean, 1 hour, 2 hours, that's nothing. Like I to really
mm.
spend, a week. I mean, you spent 3 years to get to even know, I mean, you can't learn anything in a day or a week. But I guess my question for you is, what did that process do to you? What did you feel like you become such an observer? Did you kind of lose a sense of your self or ego in that process?
Yes, 100%. And I think because I teach these methods, I've been reflecting a lot on how I can't teach my students to like it, to love doing this. I can teach you all the technical things, how to take field notes, how to do interviews, how to write, all of that, how to gain consent, how to talk about people participating in your research. But you have to really have a disposition that you're okay being in places that you're going to feel out of place, not knowing anything, questioning why you're even there, having all these things go through your mind, feeling uncomfortable, feeling whatever it is. And you still got to love being there. So I think for me, when I'm immersed doing field work, it's my favorite part. When I have to write, it's not my favorite part, although it's part of my job. But for me, research or doing field work or ethnographer is my biggest piece of identity as a professional, because I think the small moments, I'm just so consumed by them that I feel like I'm the right person to be in those spaces, because I'm so consumed by the mother chopping some pineapple in the kitchen and plating for their kid and putting on the table, and the kid coming, picking it up, sitting next to her, putting his head on her shoulder.
Oh.
Her, you know what I mean? Like I am so consumed by documenting and seeing that because I love it, so much. And then you don't think about yourself in that way because you're just so consumed about other people's lives,
Mm.
in that way. And also the commitment to be able to honor people's lives, because often you can write something that may make people angry, right? Because I am in those homes and not everything is good, right? There's yelling, there's parents saying terrible things to their kids, there's teachers saying terrible things to parents and to children, there's peer-to-peer disrespect, there's racism. There's so much that is heartbreaking and it makes you lose some hope, right, when you're there. But what I've learned is that if you stay on one perspective, then you don't understand how you even got there, right? Why was this kid even being mean to the other kid? What happened before?
Mm.
What are the things? And this is not to justify behavior, but it's to understand how we got there. Because then I do believe we make better policy when we do better pedagogically, right? All of that. But I think
Mm.
your ego is at the door. Once you're in people's homes and lives, and it's not about you, it's, and again, not everybody's into that. And I understand.
Would you, so for the 3 years, was that part of your grad schooling or was that separate or how did that work?
So there's a few projects, I would say like four main projects that I've done. I'm not going to go through all of them, don't worry. But the first one was grad school, was my dissertation. So when I was doing my PhD in anthropology and education, I did my work, which resulted in my first book. And then after I got my first job as assistant professor, your time changes. When I was a grad student, I had just had so much more flexibility. I would be everywhere all the time with the families. Like, I'd just be out from 7 a.m. until 10 p.m. every day. And then now I have a real grown-up job. I have kids, right? I have all these things that I have to just structure my life a little bit differently, which means sometimes I bring my own kids with me or, different things that I have to do in order to be able to be in those places. A little bit easier to be in schools because that's more structured. I know that I get to go to one place. But the first one was in grad school. The other ones I had to get more organized to say, I'm in the field Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, blocked from 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. Nothing can change that, that's kind of versus just being
Wow.
able to go whenever.
Wow. So who primarily funds this type of research? Because it takes a lot of time for like some very niche insights, right?
Yes. So for me, I've gotten funding from either the university or so Harvard, or when I was at Columbia Teachers College, but also the National Academy of Education. Spencer Foundation has funded two of my projects so far. So because the insights really become these applied things that you can think about for teachers and educators on how to do better
Mm.
in the classroom. So I always have like an applied um, thread, you know? So, what should we know? And that's like the number one thing that school districts ask me to do when I go do teacher training and professional development is can you tell us about what it means to go to school in Honduras and what it means to go to school in Brazil and what is it that they are interested in doing here, right? Like knowing the population they're serving, there's a real gap because what are the teachers going to do? Find out about 25 kids full life histories, although I think we could if we incorporate that from the beginning in our curriculum. But I'm trying to kind of fill a gap for this is what you can know about an immigrant child that arrives into your classroom. These are the things you can ask to build
Mm.
trust and to improve learning.
Wow. This is amazing. This is cool. This is so cool. Thanks for even opening this world to me. And yeah, I mean, truly amazing. That's so awesome.
Oh, I'm glad.
Yeah, I feel like I'm now open to another world out there that I didn't know before. And I really appreciate you sharing all your insights and perspectives. I feel like you opened up another kind of way for me to think about things that like I've been kind of closed off to. So I'm excited to get into more, just learn more. So thanks.
Oh my goodness. I think you do this is definitely my favorite interview to even talk about, my work because I think sometimes if you don't say it out loud, you lose sight of why is it that you do what you do. And then sometimes it takes somebody else to say, it's pretty great. You know what I mean? Because you because it can feel, lonely, self-reflective, and you're in your head and you're the sole ethnographer collecting that data and you're, going through all those moments on your own. And I think having this type of conversation of kind of the sense of wonder, right? Like, what does this mean? And how do you, is really, really refreshing. So you're doing it. You're doing the work for all of us.
No, no, that's sweet. But thank you so much for coming and taking your time on a very busy. I know school's ending, so thank you for taking your time. I had a great time talking.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I want to say thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did, and as per usual, stay re-educated.